As I mentioned earlier, this is Tanzania Highlights, and James is in-country specialist for Lemala Camps and Lodges, which is a preferred partner of Africa Safari Excellence in Tanzania. The whole idea about today's session is not showing beds and rooms and saying this is a lodge with so many rooms. It's really telling you about why your guests should come to East Africa and just enticing you. This is very much conversational, so please feel free to ask a question at any time. I am going to hand over to James, who has prepared a magical presentation that I had the privilege of seeing very briefly yesterday. So I am super excited to see what he's got in store for us. So thank you very much, James.
Okay, so folks, I'm going to do something a little bit strange. I'm not really going to talk about products so much. I'm going to talk about inspiration, and I'm going to talk about inspiration on two levels. One on an emotional level, and one on a financial level. And what I'm going to hope to achieve by the end of it is to show you why African tourism, and I'm going to talk specifically about Tanzania, but it applies to most of the rest of Africa as well, is quite simply the best game in tourism around the world at the moment, both from an emotional point of view and from a financial point of view. A little bit of history. I'm 55 years old. I've been around the world too often. But when I was growing up as a kid, if you looked at magazines like this, Travel and Leisure or Condé Nast and what have you, and all the best places to go in the world, when I was younger, so 20, 30 years ago, those lists were dominated by Asia. And they were dominated by Asia, if I can characterize and just put into a box, they were dominated by big resorts, great services, smart spas that had more lemongrass patchouli oils flying around than anywhere else in the entire world. Now, if you go to those same magazines now, you'll find in the top 100 that 30 or 40% will be in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think there are three things that combine to have driven the success over the last 2 decades within the travel media of Africa as a destination. Number one, in fact, the three things are that you need to be staying somewhere small or boutique or whatever word you want to use. You want to be staying somewhere where you learn something. So it's educational, where you feel that you've returned from your hard-earned vacation with a gift of experience and knowledge rather than just a trinket or a souvenir that you take home with you. And lastly, that you've contributed. You've made the world, one way or the other, a better place. I want to talk to you about the kinds of property that Lemala operates. We only have, our largest property is 15 beds. Our smallest is 3. Now, by definition, an East African safari product is going to be smaller and more boutique than a 200, 300 bed resort hotel on an island in Asia or a big city hotel in anywhere in the world, for practical reasons. Yeah, they've always been small, and they've always been small because you can't have everybody that goes on their safari drive at 6 o'clock each morning, leaving a property at 6 o'clock at the same time. You can't get that many cars through. Also, because East African tourism in particular has always been very, very clued in to environmental concerns, because its heyday and its origins was based on the idea of tents in the middle of nowhere, because there was no road, there was no infrastructure, there was no electricity, there was no plumbing. So you had to go self-contained and small. So this property here is in Tarangire. Now, Tarangire only has 4 permanent properties in the whole of the park. It's probably the most underutilized park in the northern circuit of Tanzania, and in the height of the dry season, probably has the best game viewing, even better than the Serengeti and the Mara, because when it's dry, all the wildlife comes down to this riverbed, the Tarangire River, and the wildlife species there exist closer together. If you drive around places like the Mara and the Serengeti, you will see 2 or 3 species in one frame of the photograph, maximum. If you go down to the swamps, Silali swamps in Tarangire National Park, you can see 7 or 8 different wildlife species within one single frame of a photograph. So it's a great favorite of all of the private guides because there's so few beds in the whole park. It's still large, and you have all this intermingling of wildlife that you don't get in many other places. So that East Africa's always done boutique.
James, can I ask a question here? It's really amazing that it's so boutique, but what do you find? How long should people stay more or less in Tarangire? Because it almost seems like it's a one-night stop on the way to somewhere else, and you know, when it's such a fantastic destination, you really want to encourage people to stay longer.
I think there's a couple of questions sort of rolled up into that. Now, I spent July and August, both months, the whole of that 2-month period in Tarangire. Firstly, it's underutilized. Secondly, I think in a post-COVID world, people are well advised to take good advice from a travel advisor and travel a little bit slower. In other words, spend less time traveling, but more time being in a location. So rather than rushing to 5 different camps and having 2 nights, 2 nights, 2 nights over your 10 days, cut it to 3 and do 3 in each and have 9 days and then 1 camp right at the end and having 4. So I think the trend generally is for longer stays and fewer camps and choose quality. So that's emotionally and from an experience point of view. I'd add some value to that from a budget point of view. It makes sense. If you think about it, on a day when you move, you're probably, if you're flying, you're probably spending 1.5 times your accommodation cost for that day. Yeah. So you drop the total cost of your safari up.
And you actually just cut your experience in half because most of the day is out of action. You're not really going to have that safari experience that you have by staying longer.
Yeah. So specifically in relation to Tarangire, I can give you the answer from what I'm seeing as the trends in the business. We've been mercifully quite busy over the last 3 years. So our average stay at Pingo Ridge in Tarangire has gone from 2.4 to 2.9 nights. So that's not so much me telling people what I think they should do, it's what people are doing. And I think that's the interpretation of why they're doing it. They're spending more time in fewer locations to know it better. Now, I think, again, in a post-COVID world, people are interested in feeling that they are bigger and better for the money they've spent on an experiential holiday. That it doesn't just end with a nice spa and you go home and you're a little bit relaxed and you can go to work with a clean complexion and well massaged. That when you come home, that you have learned something that makes you bigger and better, and you feel better about yourself and the world. Now, again, East Africa or Africa in general has always done this. If you think about it, there is no opportunity, and I don't think there ever should be an opportunity for someone from, forgive me, Elizabeth, but from Arizona to come out and hire a $120,000 Land Cruiser and self-drive around the Serengeti. And the reason why I say that is partly there's no road signs, you get lost. 2, $150,000 worth of Land Cruiser is very, very easy to break, bend, or destroy on the roads that we have out here. And it's not something you do lightheartedly. Secondly, or lastly, I suppose, it's something I'd recommend against simply because if you did that, you'd miss everything. Because if you're arriving from somewhere else in the world, you don't know which tree to look in to see a leopard's tail hanging down. You don't know what the barking of an impala when it's next to a thicket means, and that it's quite possible on the other side of the thicket there's a leopard. In other words, you're not having the environment that you're there to visit interpreted for you. It would just be a 4x4 driving expedition. The person that sits next to you knows where to look, knows what the sounds mean, can explain what the flight of a flappet lark is like and why that's important. Yeah. So Africa is always educational and has to be educational on a superficial level of just enjoying the environment and learning about wildlife species. But it's also, what's the old saying? Come to Africa to see the animals, fall in love with the people. Yeah, we have a cultural relevance and a simplicity here, which is more and more appealing in a more and more complicated and complex world. Now, let me tell you a story about this guy here. This is a guy called Chief Lemala. Chief Lemala is quite young to be a Maasai chieftain. He lives outside Tarangire National Park. He runs a community there that we do a lot of work with on many different levels. One of the things that we do with him, we have quite two big programs that revolve around girl-child education. As I say, both my wife and I come from a teaching background. Now, girl-child education is really, really important. I'll talk about a secondary project in a second, but the primary project that we have here is of making sure that these young girls go to school. And that's an education which is traditionally not very easy for them to access. Usually, if there is money to be spent on education, it will go to the boy child. Now, we do a lot of sponsorship work. We facilitate and we make it possible for a lot of these young girls to go to school. But when this was first happened, Chief Lemala got a lot of resistance from the local community, from the, let's call them the Luddites, the reactionaries, the people that didn't want to see progress. Chief Lemala has 2 big water tanks for collecting rainwater outside his house, his manyatta. And he came home one evening and both of them had been speared. So big holes in them, big gashes, no water, big disaster. He turned around and he said, well, James, I think I've got a simple solution. I said, okay, what's that solution? He says, I'll just build concrete water tanks and they can blunt their spears. Now, that should almost be a buy phrase for a project which is, it should be a banner headline for any project which is trying to create change and improvement. Let them blunt their spears. We try and arrange it that our guests have some kind of touch point with all these things, so that they go home feeling not just that their finance has facilitated this, that's just conscience, but also that they have come home with a message that they can apply at home. Yeah, that they can feel bigger about themselves. The second project, again, girl-child oriented. This is a project that was started by a member of our staff, and it's shocking in many ways. So we have a Maasai guide that works for us. He's 22 years old, 23 years old, recently got married, and was quite shocked when he discovered and learnt why his 2 younger sisters didn't go to school for 2 or 3 days every single month. He only learned that when he got married. Wasn't part of the sex ed program in Moran school. So we have started with him a reusable sanitary pad project with the girl children or the ladies in the local schools in order to facilitate longer, more consistent attendance at school. Now, we fund this out of donations from guests. So each girl in the 6 or 7 schools that we support gets a gift of a small backpack with, believe it or not, first and foremost, underwear, and then reusable sanitary pads, and instruction and support on how to use them. The idea isn't just to clear up a menstruation issue. It's also to demystify the conversation around it. I'm an East African guy. 10 years ago, I would not have had this conversation in public. Yeah, it would have been something that would have been uncomfortable for me, and probably for my mother to have discussed. But now here I am. I'm on an international call talking about a subject that is, for me, is demystified, and hoping that it becomes demystified for the adult males that come on safari with Lemala and their children, their teenagers, their brothers and sisters can talk, and they can go home and talk about it, and they can talk about it at school. So again, the idea that you're not just giving, but when you're giving, you're getting. Yeah, you're giving financially to support something, and you are becoming a conduit for further education beyond that particular field.
I think James, that's such a wonderful story, and I think one of the things that I found in East Africa for many years is that these stories have always been underplayed, because the lodges have always done these philanthropic and community projects, and we've never really pushed it on travelers to say this is really what your money is doing. It's not just about having a vacation or having a safari, but it goes so much further within the communities.
But I think, Monet, you're absolutely right. I think what has happened is that the zeitgeist, the taste for tourists around the world has kind of backed into what tourism in Africa, safari tourism, has always done. Yeah, we've always done, East African safari tourism has always done these things. It's just now that tourists around the world are catching up to that's what they want. Okay, so here's the next challenge. If we were all in a room together, I would turn all the lights out and I would encourage everybody to close their eyes and then simply to think of the word Africa, and then remember that image that's in front of their mind. And then we're going to move to the next screen. And I pretty much guarantee that each and every one of you either picked the silhouette of a giraffe against a setting sun, or an elephant against an acacia tree, or next a Masai warrior in the middle of nowhere. That little game, and it would be much more effective if we all had the pleasure of all being in a single room together in a movie theater or something and completely blacked out. But that little game is designed to prove that to some extent, each and every single one of us is already pre-programmed to define Africa as the kind of sites you see in East Africa. Yeah, whether it's because we grew up watching Hatari with John Wayne or Johnny Weissmuller. Sorry, I am old. Like a lot of the cultural reference points that we have for Africa are East African plains oriented. This photograph is of East Africa. It's about, I don't know, 900 meters away from where I'm sat right now. Now, who would have thought that you have a championship golf course with a driving range pointing at Kilimanjaro, 190 kilometers south of the equator in East Africa? It's not something that is automatically apparent to everybody. This is Arusha. This is somewhere where you can arrive. You can spend 2 nights in Arusha before you go on a safari. And you can have wonderful food. You can play a game of polo. You can play a game of golf. You can go kayaking on the lakes on Momella or Mount Meru, only about half an hour from that photograph.
For those that are not familiar, Arusha is really the gateway to safari in Tanzania. Every single guest just about travels through Arusha that goes on safari.
It's well worth it. And if we go back to the beginning, we're talking about how people are perhaps spending longer and knowing things better. I'm constantly amazed, and I have been my entire life. People spend large sums of money coming whole way out to East Africa. They land at 11 o'clock at night, they get to bed at 12 o'clock, and then they've got to get up at 5:30 and go on safari. Don't know about you guys, but that doesn't sound like a holiday to me. Unless you are particularly cash rich and time poor, spend a day to recover and be fresh so that when you go on your first safari, you actually know what you're looking at and you're not propping your head up going, oh, I can't believe I'm awake. So again, encouraging people just to be a little bit slower and enjoy a little bit more. From here, I'm just going to talk about the flow of a safari through Tanzania. So this next photograph, again, Tarangire National Park, just because it's an emotional home to me. I think one of the things that surprises a lot of people over the evolution of East African safari over the last 5 years is how the quality of the product has gone through the roof. Our infrastructure in Tanzania didn't used to be particularly good. I can remember driving to Tanzania 35 years ago where you literally had to bring toilet paper with you to go to the washroom. You'd have to bring a light bulb, and that really isn't much of an exaggeration. Now we can source decent rosé from South Africa, a nice red from Chile. We can have nice wine. We work with mostly local ingredients, but Tanzania is one of the most productive farming countries in the whole of Africa. We can grow just about everything. So we don't need to import much food, but we will import cheese. We won't import herbs and spices which are pre-packed and ready mixed. We'll make our own curry powder. Yeah, and we'll make it out of raw ingredients that we can buy on Zanzibar and on the coast and up country. So we do very much that whole farm to table thing. We can also build in these most wonderful locations. If you imagine this, so this is Pingo Ridge, Tarangire. It's 300 feet above the Tarangire River up a slope. It is quite difficult to get there, even a 4x4 Jeep. It's a well-crafted road now, but we have to go over rocks, we have to go around trees, through riverbeds to get there. So it's quite adventurous. Building here 20 years ago would have been impossible. Yeah, we built here with recycled steel. I think we worked out the numbers the other day. We use recycled steel here for the plinths for the tents, which are equivalent to 10 old vehicles scrapped. Yeah, so we build all the tents. They're massive tents, indoor, outdoor bathroom. This is a sunken deck outside where you can sleep out at nighttime overlooking the river. We have solar power here, which is good enough to power a mini bar in the room, a hairdryer, a 12-volt kettle, so you can make tea and coffee for yourself first thing in the morning if you choose, rather than ordering from room service. We can do all these things that we couldn't do in the past. We recycle. We actually produce drinking water out of groundwater here. We filter it 3 times and then reverse osmosis once. And we do all that in order to completely eliminate single-use plastic water bottles the whole way through the Lemala portfolio. Simply because we've got a well here. All that technology didn't used to exist. I'm going to move on, if I may. So another favorite, Ngorongoro. So we have a simple camp here. So we have a tented camp. We have a tented camp on a side of the crater, which is not often used. Now, I don't know how much everybody knows about the Ngorongoro crater, but it's 21 kilometers across. It's a big circle. It's the largest intact collapsed caldera in the whole world, which basically means it's the inside of a volcano. The slopes are so steep, and there's so much water, rain, and prolific grass. The wildlife doesn't need to ever move. It doesn't need to migrate. It's a stable population. It has the big 5 down there. It's so plush that it has been described as the world's most intact and amazing zoo. Not because we've got fences. We've got natural fences. We've got these walls of this caldera, which are almost 900 meters tall, and very few places where the wildlife can come in and out. So we have a camp on the side, and we come down each morning with some of the first people there and with some of the last people out. But also because we've got wonderful people working for us, but also because of the relationships we have with the local authorities and with just with the relationships we have with the local authorities, we are one. I think at the moment, actually, we are literally the only people that have been providing fully catered hot meals on the Ngorongoro crater floor. Now, that's a very easy thing to say, but imagine sitting yourself at that table with a proper home-cooked meal. So a proper hot-cooked meal. So not a sandwich box with some cold salad and a plastic knife and fork in a box. Proper crockery, knives, forks, not crystal because it would break, but nice quality glasses. Having a nice steak and a glass of Malbec or a glass of Shiraz, and looking up at your partner sat opposite you and noticing that there were 3 as a tower of giraffe passing by, about 20, 30 yards behind them. Or some zebra, or an elephant in the distance. Those are the things which do 2 things, I think. One, from a tourist point of view or a guest point of view, they are memories that can stay with you forever. Secondly, they are things that can validate, and this is where I start talking to you as professionals, they can validate the choice that consumer made to book with you. because not everybody gets it. And if the other tourists on the bus don't get it, and if the other tourists on the plane don't get it, then your guys feel special. And if they feel special themselves, then they feel that they made a good choice working with you. So those validations are really, really important. Elephant in the room, I'll talk about the Serengeti now. Right. East Africa and the migration. It's always a big topic. I would encourage you to do two things whenever anybody asks you about the migration. The first thing would be to ask them what the word migration means to them. Because to me, the word migration means about 2.5 million wildebeest, zebra, Thompson gazelles being followed around the Masai Mara and Serengeti ecosystem in a clockwork fashion. Scientifically, that's true. And they're followed by predators, in particular lions and hyenas. Now, that's what it means to me. What it means to most consumers is something a lot more simple. A wildebeest jumping into a river and being eaten by a crocodile. Now, if that's what it means to your client or your potential client, you need to know that really, really early. And you need to know that really, really early because there's only one part of the Serengeti where that happens, and that's in the north. And that's only over a 3-month period. So the second question is, if that is what the migration means to you, can you travel between August and November? Because if not, you're very unlikely to see it. So this photograph here is taken in the southern part of the Serengeti. The southern part of the Serengeti is, they call it the short grass plains. Now, I can give you the science behind it, but in essence, it is a part of the Serengeti which for a relatively short period of time, for about 4 months of the year, has lots of very, very highly nutritious grass that grows there after rain. When that grass grows, all the wildebeest flood south to eat it, and on the way south, mate and give birth. And when they get there and they give birth, they can feed their youngsters up on this highly nutritious grass, get them fat, fit, healthy, and large. And then by the end of February, March, April, then they start moving away as the grass runs out and the rain runs out. And they move further north where they have to cross these rivers. You can imagine a river infested with crocodiles like this and a baby wildebeest is not going to last very long. So the thing that drives the migration is the presence of this nutritious grass and water and where they get fat. Now, the point of explaining this to you is that the migration behaves differently in different parts of the Serengeti. So you need to know when a client can travel, and you need to know what they want to see at that time to make sure that you don't mismatch them. So if your client's family comes back and says, I can only travel in February, but I want to see river crossings, it isn't going to happen. There isn't a river. The wildebeest will be nowhere near. There are no rivers in the southern part of the Serengeti, which is where the migration will be. So you need to be clear about that right from the beginning. One last geographical point is the next slide is the East African coast. I've got two things to say about that. One, Lemala doesn't have a property here, so I don't have any skin in this particular game. But back in my youth, North American guests very seldom went to the East African coast because, quote, we've got the Caribbean, why would we go there? It's very true. But what the Caribbean doesn't have is the cultural intensity, and it doesn't have the untouched appeal of some of the places on the Kenya coast and on the Zanzibari coast. So hopefully what I've done so far is show you the emotional reasons why East Africa appeals to your consumers. And I hope I've given you some tools that you can use to enthuse any guests. We're going to move on now and talk about your pocketbook. So the tone changes. Now we're going to talk hard money. East Africa is emotional. We've established that. It's also, I think, the best game in tourism for travel professionals, partly because if any of us go to New York, we don't work with a travel agent or a travel advisor to book it. I'd say that's very rare these days. Now, the reason for that is that, you can you can jump in a yellow cab at JFK, and you can book online. You can go to booking.com or an aggregator or whoever you want, or book with a property direct. East Africa is different because it's one of few destinations around the world which are almost entirely itinerized. In other words, very few people come to East Africa and go to one safari camp with one transfer, a transfer back to the airport, and leave. They go to multiple areas. They rely upon advice because there aren't many internationally known brands out there that work in the safari industry, mostly because the big brands don't get safari. There are a couple that are starting to invest, but they always seem to think that they need 70 or 80 beds that aren't boutique, and they want to commercialize it and sell through points. Now, the itinerization of a destination that requires advice is scary for the consumer. I gave a speech once in Dubai where a lovely lady stuck her hand up at the end of the conversation and said, but James, East Africa is so complicated. And I said, that's great, isn't it? And she said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, because if you invest the time in not making it complicated for yourself, and it's still complicated for the consumer, then you still have relevance to that consumer. You have something they don't have. You can add value to the advice that you give them in order to secure that booking. And Expedia can't sell a safari itinerary. Practical one. East Africa serviced by all these airlines, and therefore all of these fly points, all these opportunities to use your points to upgrade meaningfully rather than a 2-hour flight from Denver to Seattle or whatever it is, and all these aggregators. So I'm going to open up to questions now, but what I hope I've done is demonstrated that East Africa has an intrinsic appeal to consumers, even if they don't know it yet, and that you have an opportunity to share that emotion. And once you've shared that emotion, if you succeed in securing a booking, that the financial benefit to you is more significant than anywhere else. So in other words, it's worth work, it's worth learning. Yeah. Anytime you invest in learning, East Africa will pay you back in spades, in buckets. Yeah, it's a good deal. Is that a round of applause from the dog in the back?
Sorry, that was my gremlin.
No, don't worry. You're lucky my hound hasn't been barking in the background.